Well, good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to be going through 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 5 through 8. So go ahead and turn there. All right. For we never use flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't seek glory from people either, from you or from others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you, as a nurse nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. Let's go ahead and pray. Dear Lord, I thank you for today, and thank you for this time that we get to come together and worship you as a church. Lord, I ask that right now you would give us understanding so that we can understand this passage better and leave with a greater understanding of you and also preaching your word. Lord, I thank you again, and it's in your name I pray. Amen. All right, so now we've read it, I want to take a couple minutes to highlight some of the main ideas of this. So first we have the main idea of this section, which is verses 1 through 12 of chapter 2, which is going over Paul and the apostles' conduct among the Thessalonians. They were, it's important to understand this because we want to look at this as a way to model how we conduct ourselves as well. For example, last week John was talking about, John preached on the fact that when you preach and share the gospel, it should come with an appeal. He didn't just make that up. He got it because that's how Paul and the apostles did it. When they preached the gospel, it came with an appeal. And so when we preach the gospel, it ought to come with an appeal as well. In these verses, what we're going to see is that when we share the gospel, it should come with one motive. There shouldn't be any other motives with it. And that motive should be to glorify God or to please him. And that should be really what we want to take away from this. So let's take a look, and as we do, let's focus and remember that. And I don't know, I'm really excited to actually preach on this because when I was asked to preach, it's my first time and I was extremely nervous, but getting to study this has really helped change how I look at it, and I'm not nearly as nervous now because I realize the importance of really preaching not for me to look good, but rather to please God and to praise him for it. So in verse 5 it says, "For we never use flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness." And now he says that because first he says, we never use flattering speech, as you know, right? That one's easy to attest to. The Thessalonians that were there could remember that as Paul and the apostles were there, they didn't do that, right? They weren't flattering. They weren't praising the people for anything and everything they could think of to get them on their good side. They simply spoke the gospel. Similarly, he then says, we didn't have greedy motives. The Thessalonians can't necessarily, can't know the state of Paul and the apostles' hearts, right? They can't look at them and say, these guys are good, they have good motives. They can only rely on their word, and so what Paul says is, look, God is our witness. God, the one who knows hearts, is our witness. He can attest to the fact that we didn't have greedy motives. Then he says, and we didn't seek glory from people either from you or from others. Now you might notice that I'm going through verse 6. If you have most other versions, I have the CSB, but in most other versions, it includes the beginning half of verse 7, but I like to include that in verse 7. I think it makes a lot of sense. So I'm only going through the first half of verse 6. But he says, we didn't seek glory. It was really common in the Roman Empire for itinerant preachers or speakers to go around speaking. And they went around, they were paid to speak, preach, sometimes prophesize or whatever. And they weren't necessarily always Christian. It could have been a number of things, but they were known to go around speaking. And one of the motive that they had was to become famous, to get a lot of glory so they could charge more money to keep speaking. They wanted a following and things like that. Paul, Timothy, and Silas, on the other hand, were nothing like that. While these itinerant preachers would often speak or wouldn't want to share unless they were being paid to, Paul, Timothy, and Silas never were paid. They were glad to speak and share what they had to say freely. It was very different from the way that the itinerant preachers were doing it. Similarly, they didn't have a desire to be popular or to gain a following. Instead, they came and preached about someone else entirely, not themselves, right? Interestingly enough, I think we could assume that not only did they not want to be popular or famous, but they were actually prepared to be treated just as poorly as they were in Philippi. Earlier on, it says in verse 2, on the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. They were prepared to face the same type of treatment that they did in Philippi, to be mistreated, and they even initially were met with great opposition in Thessalonica. Now, getting into verse 7, or the second half of verse 6, and then verse 7. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you, as a nurse nurtures her own children. To prove this actually really proves what he said in verse 5, that they didn't have greedy motives. They could have been a burden. They could have requested, and as apostles of Christ, that the new believers in Thessalonica would support them financially. If you want to turn over to verses 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 3 through 14, we'll see another example of this. It says, my defense to those who examine me is this: don't we have the right to eat and drink? Don't we have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife like other apostles, the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Or who shepherds a flock and does not drink the milk from the flock? Am I saying this from a human perspective? Doesn't the law also say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it treads out grain. Is God really concerned about oxen? Isn't he really saying it for our sake? Yes, this is written for our sake, because he who plows ought to plow in hope, and he who threshes should thresh in hope of sharing the crop. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it too much if we reap material benefits from you? If others have this right to receive benefits from you, don't we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. Instead, we endure everything so that we will not hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who perform the temple service eat the food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the offerings of the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should earn their living by the gospel. Paul and the apostles had a right to request material benefits, but he says here that they didn't. They were instead very gentle among them. And they did this for a couple reasons. Number one, they did it because they wanted to, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians, they didn't want to hinder the going forth of the gospel and cause people to think that maybe they had an ulterior motive for preaching the gospel. But also, they did it because they cared deeply for the Thessalonians, and they wanted to be gentle among them. He gives the example of a nursing mother, right? A nursing mother doesn't request rent from their baby. That would be absurd, right? A nursing mother doesn't say that the baby should make dinner tonight so that the mother could eat. Instead, the nursing mother feeds herself so that she can feed her baby. She makes sure to watch what she eats so that she doesn't make her baby sick, right? If she eats the wrong stuff, her baby will get sick. If she doesn't eat, then she'll starve, and in turn, the baby will starve. Similarly, Paul and the apostles made sure to take care of themselves so that they could continue taking care of the Thessalonians. They didn't want to put any strain or burden on these new believers. Now, about this time, I want to take a moment to remind everybody, we should be looking at these examples as how we should model our lives as well. This is an important one. It can be really easy to listen to this and say, well, I am not a pastor. I'm not going to other towns and winning over a lot of converts and anything like that. So this doesn't really apply to me. But it does. Everyone here, we should remember that if we are a Christian, and if we've been Christian for any amount of time, it's almost guaranteed that other people who are new to the faith will be looking to us for an example. And so similarly, we don't want to be refusing to grow in our own walk. We don't want to be coming on a Sunday, not paying attention. We don't want to be not reading our word, not growing. Because if we're doing that, then those who are looking to us for an example will be seeing that and will do the same thing. If we are taking in the wrong stuff, right? If we're getting all kinds of incorrect theology or just making stuff up as we go, people who look to us for an example will look to us and say, okay, well, they're doing it, so I'll do it too. If we're unhealthy in our faith, people who look up to us will very likely also be unhealthy in their faith. So we should seek to be healthy. We should seek to be growing in our own faith so that we can be not only taking care of ourselves, but also taking care of those around us who might be looking to us. And like I said, it's not just if you're a pastor or if you're a preacher somewhere else, or a missionary. It's if you are a Christian, I can almost guarantee there's people, even the same age, maybe even older, that look to you for an example. To give one, when I became a Christian, my best friend, who was the one who started bringing me to church and to youth group, is the one I looked up to as an example, or not the one, but one of the people that I looked up to for an example. It didn't matter that he was only 9 months older than me. What mattered was that he had been a Christian for much longer than I had. And if he had been practicing all sorts of unhealthy things, then I would have too. If he would have been very just making things up as he goes, I would have too. But because he was healthy in his faith, I was able to be healthy in mine. Similarly, it doesn't matter your guys' age. Older or younger, it doesn't matter. People are looking up to you if you're a believer. And then moving on to verse 8. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you became dear to us. So, just like the nursing mother, Paul and the apostles shared with the Thessalonians, not only the gospel, but also their own lives. And I want to highlight the word life here, or lives. When I first read it, it made sense to me to think of it more like they were living among the Thessalonians, and that was like sharing their lives with them, right? The Thessalonians were able to look into how they lived. But it's actually a lot more than that. The word for life is, I'm going to butcher this so bad, but it's suche. And it is the Greek or like the literal translation is soul, or very being, or like very self. In other versions, I don't know if anyone has like NASB, for example, but I believe it says my very self, or our very selves. I think ESV might say something similar as well. But the idea is that they shared everything with the Thessalonians. They didn't hold back. And they did that because the Thessalonians had become so dear to them. And they wanted to be gentle with these new believers so that they could be healthy, right? We should be doing the same. We should be pouring into other people and not holding back, but trying to disciple people and make them healthy. And the only way we can do that is if we're also healthy in our faith. So, as we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone. Remember that preaching the gospel can only come with one motive. You want to preach the gospel to please God. If you're doing it for anything, for example, if your motive can be summed up as please God and, you might want to reconsider what your motives are. You might want to take a step back and consider what's that and why is it? If you want to preach the gospel, you're concerned about how you look while doing it, take a step back and consider, why is that? Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians, talks about how he preached the gospel in simple terms, not using impressive speech, because he wanted to highlight the gospel, not how articulate he was as a preacher. We should be making sure that our motive for preaching the gospel is to please God and nothing else. And then we should be remembering that as we go about our lives, there's people that look to us for an example. And if we're not healthy in our lives, if our lives are full of unhealthy practices, then so will theirs. They're going to be looking to us and seeing unhealthy practices and then following that. But if we're practicing a healthy lifestyle, or rather a healthy walk, where we're reading consistently, we're praying consistently, then those around us who look to us will be doing the same. So let's remember to do that. So let's go ahead and pray. Dear Lord, I ask that as we finish up, we would, and as we go through this week, we would remember to practice living a healthy lifestyle, a spiritual life, Lord, that we would be reading and praying and growing in our walk, not stagnating, not taking in unhealthy beliefs or anything like that. Lord, likewise, I ask that when we would be sharing the gospel with others, we would be doing so with the right motive, that our motive would be to please you and nothing more. Lord, I ask these things in your name. Amen.